Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'm not sure if there's anybody present. Oh yes, I can see some faces I haven't necessarily seen before. So I will do a very quick introduction. My name's Yvonne Wright. I'm one of the inspectors who's been appointed to examine the legal compliance and soundness of this plan. And I have my colleague here today as well, Mr. Warden, who may also come into the discussions and may ask questions as well.
Good morning.
Thank you. I'm not proposing to do any further introductions, setting out how the process and procedures occur, how today is going to go ahead. I will just let you know that, again, we will be having a mid-morning break as per normal, as required, and we hope that this session will finish certainly by 1 o'clock at the latest, but hopefully sooner than that. But we will see how the discussions go, because we've got quite a bit to get through this morning. Now we're here this morning to discuss several. It's all under matter 13, but I've subcategorized them to try and make it easier for the discussions. So we're here this morning to discuss 13D, 13E, 13F, and 13G. And then this afternoon we have A, B, and C in relation to matter 13. So it's all under the environment. And the issue under discussion is our issue 14, which is, does the plan set out a positively prepared strategy for the natural built and historic environment that is justified, effective and consistent with national policy? And does the plan adequately address climate change and other environmental matters? And are the policies sound? And obviously that same issue is relevant for this afternoon's sessions as well. Now, although we've got several sub-matters, I am proposing that for each of those, when we start into 13D and then when we go into 13E and 13F, etc., I will introduce participants relevant to that session that have been invited to that session. However, the council is here all day. So I'm not proposing that the council has to introduce themselves every time. Only those members of your team that are only coming to certain sessions. So if the council just wants to do an overall introduction this morning now, and then I won't ask the council to introduce yourselves later on.
Very good, ma'am. Good morning to you.
Thank you.
My name is Paul Shedderevian, QC, and I'm acting for the council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy, Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Kay Polaris for Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspectors. My name is Tom Huang, Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Andrea Pearson, Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. So there's nobody else from Brentwood Borough Council who's going to be speaking this morning?
No, ma'am, that's it. Thank you.
That's okay. Right. Great. Thank you. Well, the first one that we're going to be looking at today, or the first matter, is 13D, which is on the green belt policies. So can I ask, I've got 3 participants listed that should be in this session. So Blackmore Village Heritage Association.
Good morning, Mrs. Wright. Good morning, all. It's Bill Ratcliffe, Chairman of Blackmore Village Heritage Association.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At Tesco, please.
Good morning, ma'am, and others. Rupert Warren, QC for Tesco, instructed by G.L. Hearn.
Thank you. Mr. Warren, is anybody else expected to speak on behalf of Tesco?
Ma'am, nobody's expected to speak. I have Mr. Atkinson with me and Mr. McDonald also on the transport side, but it's very unlikely that they'll speak.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then West Horndon Parish Council, please.
Good morning. My name is Colin Fone. I'm Vice Chairman of West Horndon Parish Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Now, looking at the council's F9A document and their original Greenbelt policies and submitted plan, I note that in F9A, which is the suggested changes that the council set out, significant amendments are proposed to policy NE9 to 12 and NE15, and then the deletion of policy NE13 is suggested. Can I just suggest that we go through the policies? Obviously, we highlighted in our MIQs and in our, I think in our initial questions that some of these policies aren't consistent with national policy. So we are open to obviously making changes to those policies to ensure that they are sound, particularly in relation to consistency with national policy. So we obviously welcome the council's ability to make changes, but I would like to go through those to ensure that the wording is consistent with national policy. So can the council just go through, because it's in relation to policy NE9, the vast majority of the text is now proposed or suggested to be removed from NE9, and that it would be very much a policy that would just set out, subject to the correct wording, would just set out what national policy states in relation to Greenbelt, in relation to protecting it from inappropriate development, unless very special circumstances can be demonstrated, obviously. So can the council just explain the changes that they are proposing for NE9 to ensure that it's consistent, please?
Yeah, ma'am, the deposit draft policy NE9 really ought to be slimmed down to reflect what is in the MPPF and go no further. And that is why all those sub-paragraphs have been deleted. So the policy is simply a reflection of what the NPPF says about development in the Greenbelt.
Okay.
I didn't think it was appropriate to go beyond that. And the exceptions are dealt with in NE10.
We certainly agree with that in terms of ensuring that there is consistency with national policy on Greenbelt land. Can I just ask you to just, I'm not necessarily expecting a complete just repetition of national policy. That's not the purpose of local policy. But could you just have a double check of the suggested wording in FE09? Because, for instance, I think it still follows some of the wording in the original submitted policy. So all development proposals within the Greenbelt will be considered in accordance with the provisions of the MPPF. You may wish to say national policy. Who knows what might happen to MPPF,
yes,
etc. So you may wish to say, that because things change, etc.
Yeah,
Who knows? Development, but then you say development within the Greenbelt will only be permitted if it maintains its openness and does not conflict with the purposes of the Greenbelt, unless very special circumstances can be demonstrated to justify the proposed development. But that's not actually the case, because exceptions can be permitted in Greenbelt. So can you just, I'm not asking, I don't want you to go through potential changes to wording now. It's a very, I think it's just a nuance in the wording. Can you just make sure it's without completely just repeating national policy, although if it needs to be, then it needs to be. I think that'd just be useful to it just makes it very clear that there are exceptions, and those are not inappropriate. If I can put
Yes,
it,
absolutely. It does need slight tidying up to bring it in directly in line with the MPPF, and there needs to be a reference in there also to the following policy, NE10, which deals with the exceptions.
Yes.
So leave that with us, and we'll sort that one out.
Okay. Thank you. Does anybody have any comments on that policy or what we've just discussed? No. Can I move on to policy NE10 then, please? Now, this policy provides detailed criteria for the consideration of new development, extensions and replacement of buildings in the green belt. Now, this is obviously, again, the council has suggested some significant changes to the policy in F9A, which the vast majority are necessary, obviously, to ensure consistency with national policy. So I thank the council for providing some additional wording on that. Can I just clarify, though, we're getting a little bit detailed here, but just so that I can point these elements out now. National policy doesn't refer to structures at all. It only refers to buildings. And I know that your Part A refers to structures. So that really needs to be taken out to ensure that it's consistent.
Yeah.
I suppose it's what I'm trying to understand is what's the purpose of policy NE10 as suggested through F9A. It's just repeating national policy, except there is then reference to other local policies that may be taken into consideration, such as NE11 and NE12, which we'll come to a little bit later. So I'm trying to understand, is it necessary to repeat verbatim national policy?
No, it's not.
And what's that, and what that is trying to achieve within the plan? Obviously, national policy is a material consideration in determining any planning applications in the green belt. So does it need to? It's not. I'm just trying to understand, because obviously the framework makes it clear that local policy shouldn't just repeat national policy.
No, that's absolutely correct. So it's entirely possible, actually, to refer to those exceptions in NE09.
I suppose the only element is where you're adding particular requirements to national policy, such as you set out in the policy what is a disproportionate addition over and above. I know you set that out as 30%, whereas that's not set out in national policy. So that would be appropriate, subject to that being justified. That obviously would be appropriate to be set out in local policy. Again, though, I would just want to understand where that has come from, that 30%. And how that, where's the evidence about the 30%? Is it something that the council has always used, 30%?
Just trying to. Bear with me, I'm just trying to find the reference, actually.
It's in the submitted policy under D6. And then it's also under E7, where 30% is listed, and then it's then supposed to be taken out as it's then supposed to be taken out as part of your suggested changes, but then it would remain, or you would then add it to the supporting text. So I'm a little bit confused about the council's approach.
I'm just going to take some instructions on that, if I may.
Thank you. No, that's fine. Take a few minutes. That's fine.
Mr. Drain is looking into the origin of that 30%. So we would, if there is evidence to support it, we'll give it to you this morning.
Is it in the existing plan?
It is, I think, in the existing plan. We're just checking that.
Is Mr. Drain proposing to come back sort of now?
Yes, no, he's looking through documentation, so we just have to.
Shall we come back to that a little bit later then?
If you don't mind.
If at all possible during this session, that would be great. But
I mean, it is intended to delete that from the policy itself.
It is, but it's then it's whether that's necessary for soundness, because if the evidence shows that 30% is justified, then it's that reasoning as to why is it being removed if it's justified. So it's just understanding that.
We're checking that out, and we'll come back to you on that.
Thank you. Now, there's a couple of other elements in relation to the suggested new wording under Part A E. You suggest a new criteria or criterion, which is infilling in accordance with policy NE11. And we'll come on to what NE11 actually says in a moment, because obviously we'll move on to that. But is that wording consistent with national policy, which refers to limited infilling in villages?
Well, no, it's not. Clearly, it doesn't accord with that, and would need to. If we are going to include these exceptions in the policy rather than simply streamline it and refer to national policy exceptions in national policy, which is what I propose, then it would need to be amended to accord and align with the MPPF.
Thank you.
Because quite clearly, outside of the exception in the MPPF, it would most likely be inappropriate development.
Thank you. And that would also be the case for criterion G as well.
Yes.
Ensure, and again, we'll move on to what policy NE12 actually says. So, yes. And then there's also reference to NE15 as well.
Yeah.
In relation to the reuse of buildings, but we'll have a look at that, and then where necessary, elements can be changed accordingly. What I wanted to just ask before we move on to the next policy, so NE11, in relation to, again, I'm still looking at F9A and your paragraph in the supporting text, in your paragraph 8.99.
Yes, Mark.
You're proposing some additional text where you're saying that community or educational uses, you recognise that community or educational uses may be proposed or put forward in greenbelt areas, and you quite rightly state that these would be inappropriate development, but then you put a however, and you start you talk about the locational need for these types of uses will be given appropriate weight. Obviously, any locational need and any other benefits would come under other considerations, which would then go into the balance of looking at whether very special circumstances would be demonstrated. Is it appropriate to single out sort of community, this sort of infrastructure within the Greenbelt, and is it appropriate to set it out in this way?
I think what it's trying to do.
I know. Sorry, go on, Mr. Shederaven.
What it's trying to do is state the council's acknowledgement that there might be occasions when a need arises which has to be satisfied, or is argued that it has to be satisfied in the Greenbelt. Although it's not strictly necessary to have it here, that all it's doing is recognising it, but it doesn't. It's not a policy statement, and moreover, it's relatively neutral in terms of its effect, because appropriate weight will depend upon what weight is placed upon that, will depend upon the circumstances. So it's not strictly necessary to have it there, but having it there, I think, does no harm to policy or its alignment with the MPPF.
But it is a new addition, and we can only recommend new additions that are necessary for soundness.
To make it sound or the policy effective, and I have to concede it doesn't do that.
And again, your paragraph 8.102, which you're proposing to amend to ensure that it is consistent with, again, Greenbelt policy wording, although I recognise this is trying to explain something in the supporting text. Again, that's a repetition of national policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the 30% reference is something we need to investigate to see if there is the evidence to support that that threshold.
Yes, yes. If the council has evidence on that, has always used 30%, you know, and can evidence that it's in their existing policy, etc., then obviously we will have a look at that, because giving a percentage can be very useful in terms of then determining planning applications. So it would be useful to understand from your development management colleagues their take on that in using the 30% if that's been used previously.
That's understood.
And whether or whether if it hasn't been used previously and there hasn't been a percentage in a policy, whether that has caused problems from a development management perspective to understand proportionality and what is disproportionate and what isn't, and whether that's caused big issues in Brentwood.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. Mr. Drain.
Yeah, if I may, just to explain what we're just looking at, I think over the course of time, different authors of the proposals through Reg 18 consultations haven't quite got the right the clear answers yet as to where that 30% comes from. It's clear from looking at the 2005 plan that there is mention specifically of habitable floor space not being extended more than 37 square meters in terms of the context of 2005 at that time. I think it may be an attempt to consider what that looks like in more recent times, so to put a percentage figure on that rather than the specific square meter area, as is no longer required or no longer applicable. So I think we may just need to do a little bit more digging and look at that as to the background and provide that to you.
As I said, I don't necessarily have an issue with 30%, or we certainly don't necessarily have an issue with 30%. That sort of percentage can be quite normal in planning policies around that, either 25, 30, 35%, depending on the locality. So if you can just provide a little bit of background as to where that's come from, and certainly just from a development management perspective, what issues you've had within Brentwood in relation to trying to determine what is disproportionate or not, and then we'll take it from there. So thank you for that. Now,
You're on mute, Inspector.
Sorry, I did not click that. So my apologies. Part B of your submitted policy, NE10, we're still on NE10, but we are about to move off it. It includes a statement that the council will encourage the beneficial use of the greenbelt through opportunities to improve access, outdoor sport, blah, 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 etc. Now, that's obviously set out as an objective, but it is in reference to the framework, paragraph 141. So I suppose, and I know that in your F9A, you're proposing to take that out because it's a statement, is what the council is trying to encourage. It's not a requirement in terms of policy. So I suppose my question on that is, how does the plan, in terms of its policies, plan positively to enhance the beneficial use of the greenbelt? Because that's what national policy is trying to achieve in that element. So quite rightly so, that should be taken out of the policy. We totally agree with that.
That's a general question which I would need to really consider the plan as a whole in seeing how the scheme of the policies actually promote this objective. It's not something which could be promoted through this policy, obviously. So the question is whether or not the plan taken as a whole, looking at the relevant policies in the plan, actually combine to achieve this objective.
I mean, it could be through your green and blue infrastructure
yes, I mean,
policies, etc. So can I leave that one? I will leave that one with you. I'm not expecting an answer now. And
no.
Could you provide some information, just a very short note on that, to just set out where you feel that paragraph 1, the plan is seeking to provide this beneficial use, how it's providing those opportunities and how it's setting it out and positively preparing that within the plan?
We'll certainly do that in a note to you, but I think you're right that those opportunities are identified in the G&B policies.
Does anybody have any questions on policy NE10 or the suggested changes that the council has put forward in F9A on that policy? No. Okay. Can we move on then to policy NE11? Now, this lists established areas of frontage ribbon development and sets out what development should be permitted. So my first question is, are these ribbon development areas in a village? And if not, is the policy consistent with Greenbelt? National policy.
They're in the green belt outside villages.
So they are in the green belt because that's usually ribbon development. Ribbon development is, by its nature, is usually an extension, or they can be, it's development that's just started to develop along the road. So are all of these areas that are listed, are they all outside villages?
They are outside villages, I'm instructed.
Okay. So this policy isn't consistent with national policy then? No,
it is not, no.
Okay. So can I suggest that that's deleted?
Indeed, yeah.
As a policy. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody got any questions or queries or comments on policy NE11? Okay. if we can move on to policy NE12, can I just understand what this policy is trying to achieve? Because Greenbelt policy, unless you're talking about redevelopment, it does talk about limited infilling or partial or complete redevelopment of previously developed land. In certain instances, there can be exceptions. So I'm just trying to understand. I know that council again is putting forward suggested changes to ensure consistency.
All it's doing is repeating national policy again.
Okay. So is it doing anything above and beyond that, or trying to put a particular local slant on national policy that needs to be included in policy?
No. So again, this
So
I think,
does it need to be in?
No, there needs to be a reference to it in the amended NE09, but that's all it needs.
Okay. So is the council going to have a look at whether it's necessary to keep this, or whether it's content to delete this policy?
We will have another look at it, but my reaction to you now is that all it does, as amended, or as proposed to be amended or modified in F9A, is to repeat national policy. There's no, in terms of the deposit version, there is nothing there which wouldn't be dealt with through the application of National Greenbelt policy and other policies in the plan.
Okay. I mean, obviously, policy NE12, as set out in the submitted plan, isn't consistent with national policy anyway, so it would need changing. I suppose if my recollection is correct, you were proposing to move some elements of PCO6 into this policy. We
You're right,
discussed
yes.
that the other day, so I'm trying to then understand the connotations of that. So I don't know whether you can give, and thank you, Ms. Huang, for clarifying that my memory is still there. Are there implications for that, and does the council want to have a look at that, or is it something we can discuss now? Because that's PCO6 was the rural economy.
I think we can have a look and consider whether we retain the essence of PCO6 and retain that part in PCO6, if that's okay with you.
Yes, that's fine.
The only reference in PCO6 to the Greenbelt is that proposals are conserve and enhance local character and maintain the openness of the Greenbelt in line with NE09. So I don't think there is any conflict with PCO6 in removing NE12.
So there is, because obviously the PCO6 is suggested to be deleted, and then NE12 is suggested to be deleted.
Yeah.
Potentially,
So,
although you're just going to clarify that. Again, if you can just add that to the note that you're going to be producing on the other policies, so we just have one additional Greenbelt note policy, that would be very useful.
Yeah, so what we'll do is rationalise all these Greenbelt policies to bring them in full alignment with the MPPF and check on the 30%.
Okay.
So I propose that that's done in one single policy, NE09.
Thank you. Obviously, the council's proposing to delete or has suggested the deletion of policy NE13 because now you are proposing that site allocations in the Greenbelt and the removal of sites from the Greenbelt is going to form part of the strategic policies.
That's correct.
So you've already set that out, so we don't have an issue with that. So thank you for that. If anybody has any queries or questions, then if they want to come in on this rather than me asking if anybody's got any questions, then please do so. Thank you. Now moving on to policy NE14. Agricultural workers' dwellings are inappropriate development. So how is this consistent with national policy? I know in your hearing statement you seem to consider that it could be, in your interpretation of the framework, that dwellings for agricultural workers could be an exception to inappropriate development, but that's not the case, because the exception clearly states that it's buildings for agriculture and forestry, and a building for an agricultural workers' dwelling is a dwelling. It's not for agriculture.
That's absolutely correct,
So can I just clarify before we go down the route of suggesting deletion of NE14, are there any potential areas where agricultural workers' dwellings may be required not within the Greenbelt? And whether the council would like to keep a policy, but it would only relate to outside of the Greenbelt?
My instructions are it's very unlikely that there are instances where those dwellings might be required on agricultural land, etc., outside the Greenbelt, because we are substantially a Greenbelt borough. But we will check on that to see if there is anything within the policy that may need to be retained either here or elsewhere in the plan to deal with those circumstances. But we'll check on that.
I mean, if it's not within the Greenbelt, I'm trying to if you can double check that. I'm just trying to ensure that I understand or that we understand where agricultural workers' dwellings could be necessary. If they're within a village adjacent to the Greenbelt, then that wouldn't be an issue, and you wouldn't really need an agricultural workers' dwelling because it would be in a settlement anyway. So that wouldn't be an issue. And you've already stated that all other land is within the Greenbelt outside of settlements. So if you can just double check that for me, just to make sure that it's not a requirement for any other land not in Greenbelt, then otherwise, if you can put forward a change to delete that.
Yes, in other words, we'll investigate whether there is evidence that requires us to be here if those exceptions do exist.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. And then the final Greenbelt policy, but not my final question. I do have just a further question after this on NE15. And I suppose, again, you've got the submitted policy. And then the council, you have suggested changes in F9A. And again, can I just ask the council to look at that in relation to consistency with national policy on this front as well?
Yeah.
And whether it's necessary to make all these changes and whether it's necessary to have a policy on this or a separate policy. I know, Mr. Shadowraven, you were talking about just having potentially one policy on Greenbelt, so
yeah.
NE9. So if you can just have a look at that for me.
I will undertake that as part of the overall cleaning up exercise.
Thank you. Only because I'm not convinced that it's consistent. So thank you for that. And obviously, look, it's not just looking at the policy, it's sort of looking at all the supporting text. So
absolutely.
No, yes, and there's quite a bit of it. So
there is.
Hopefully it won't take too long. Thank you. We will give any indication as to when that note on Greenbelt could be, on these Greenbelt policies could be provided at all?
We've got a week out next week, which was in my diary as a sitting week. So I'm using next week for redrafting purposes. So hopefully you can have it as early as possible. I'll give this my priority on Monday, over the weekend and on Monday.
Appreciate that. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. That's great. If we can have it sometime next week, even if it's by Friday, that would be really useful.
You would have it,
because we may well then bring up any sort of concerns or anything like that in the reserve session that we've got, where although it's becoming less of a reserve session now because we're discussing the car park sites and there are some other issues that we will be bringing into that, but we will we will set that out. Just the final question then on Greenbelt policies, which is in relation to paragraph 138 of the framework. And I just wanted to understand how the plan accords with the particular requirement that's set out in national policy, which states that ways should be set out in which the impact of removing land from the Greenbelt can be offset through compensatory improvements to the environmental quality and accessibility of remaining Greenbelt land. There's elements of Greenbelt land proposed to be removed from the Greenbelt, and I just would like to understand how the council is proposing this offset, these compensatory improvements, and how that's set out in the plan. I think reference is made to RO1 in your Greenbelt topic paper, if I remember correctly. You refer to a green infrastructure buffer wedge on the eastern boundary with Basildon, etc. You refer to that, and then you refer to then NE10 and what NE10 was saying about beneficial use. However, that's a statement. That's not a plan providing compensatory improvement measures. So again, I'm not necessarily expecting a response now, because I know you're going to go away and have a look at this, but if you can set out how the plan is offsetting those removals from the Greenbelt in terms of environmental quality and accessibility, whether there is something in place, any policies or other documents, that would be really useful if you can point us to those.
Yes, we will. We will.
Thank you. Does anybody have any particular questions that they want to bring up in relation to matter 13D? Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Hello, good morning. I'm not sure it necessarily relates to 13D, but given the number of changes, modifications, and picking up on Mr. Shadaravian's point about needing to spend next week to redraft that, and this is just for my education, what follow-up opportunity will we have to quiz things like very special circumstances, clear and justified, and your own point about the offset compensation, particularly for the northern villages?
All documents will be made available on the council's webpage. And we need to see the additional information that the council is going to provide first. Obviously, any modifications that we recommend will be open to full public consultation as part of the main modifications process. when and if we get to that point, because obviously we're not prejudging anything at this stage. If there is something that comes forward that is considered to be new evidence, then we will ensure that people have the opportunity to comment on it and do so before the end of the hearing sessions. So it could be that people, it may be a very limited period to comment on it to assist us. If changes are being made to ensure compliance with national policy, that is a given. If it has to be done to comply with national policy, then it's done to comply with national policy. However, so those elements you will certainly have an opportunity to comment on those as part of main modifications. So everything, all changes will be open to consultation. So it's full consultation, so full normal 6-week consultation when that occurs, or if that occurs at this stage. We have no idea when that's going to occur, or if it's going to occur. As I said, we're still in the hearings stages, so it's very much we're still trying to find our way through exactly what changes need to be made, as in main modifications. Does that answer your question? So there will there will be opportunity to obviously give comments. I do wish to assure you of that.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Does that help?
That's perfect clarity. Thank you ever so much. Cheers. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you. Any other questions or queries on 13D? No. Right. Thank you. If you can just bear with me, then we can move on to the next session. I'm just going to spend a minute to just sort out my papers, so just bear with me, but we will move straight into it, so just bear with me. Ms. Feeney.
Thank you, Inspector. I've got 2 participants for 13E that haven't joined yet this morning. I have emailed them just to check on whether they are still wishing to attend. If they do respond, are you comfortable and content that I let them into the meeting?
Yes, that's fine. When did you email them? Was it quite recently?
I emailed them this morning just saying, are you coming? Because I had asked them to join at the start of the session. I haven't heard from them yet, but as of yesterday, they were due to attend.
Okay. No, that's fine. We'll continue the session as planned. If for some technical reasons they haven't been able to get hold of you, or just haven't been able to come into the sessions, then I'm content to hear anything at a later session anyway.
Okay, so, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Feeney, can I just double check who haven't we got in the meeting at the moment? Sorry, I should have asked that.
Yeah, sorry. So S&J Padfield and St Modwen.
Yeah.
And Wiggins G and Eastlight Community Homes.
Okay.
All other participants are already in the session.
Okay, I'll do introductions anyway now. Lovely. Thank you very much for that clarification. Thank you. Okay. So if everybody's got all of that papers together. I'd like to start matter 13E, and this is promoting a safe, clean and healthy environment and relates to policies NE05 and NE08. Now, my apologies, we have duplicated questions on SP03. We will be discussing that this afternoon. We're not going to be discussing that this morning because I don't want a duplication. Now, if that causes problems because somebody in this morning session wanted to discuss SP03 and can't attend this afternoon, I'm more than happy to take comments on that. I'm not sure if that does cause any problems. So if I go through the introduction in relation to those that are present in the meeting now for 13E, and then if you can let me know if it is an issue and you do want to discuss SP03 but can't attend this afternoon, then that's fine. If you can let me know then, and then I will bring in some discussion on that. So can I explained this morning, I'm not going to, first thing this morning, I'm not going to get the council to introduce themselves again, but can I ask the following people to just introduce themselves, please? Essex County Council.
Apologies, sorry. Tim Simpson.
That's okay. Good old technology.
Yeah, absolutely. The Development and Flood Risk Manager for Essex County Council.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson.
Good morning, Inspector. I'm Dr. Zaida Yusuf, and I'm working as a Senior Development and Flood Risk Officer at Essex County Council.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Mr. Minot, please.
Yes, I'm Philip Minot. I'm actually one of the local councillors, but as we've discussed before, I'm effectively not acting as a councillor at this point.
And West Horndon Parish Council, please.
Hello, my name's Colin Fone, Vice Chairman of West Horndon Parish Council.
Thank you. And I've just been informed that Wiggins G Homes and East Light Community Homes are now present in the meeting. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So as I said earlier, does anybody wish to speak on SP03 now in this session? As I said, I'm going to be taking questions or comments on that in this afternoon session. No. Okay. Can we then move on to policy NE05, please, on air quality? Now, can I first start, before we get into the detail of policies, can I first ask the council how they have approached assessment of air quality related to the planned growth that's set out within the plan, please? Is it purely, obviously I note the transport assessment, is it purely through transport assessments, or has there been a separate sort of assessment on air quality that's been carried out?
I'll ask Ms. Pilaris to respond to you on this.
Thank you.
So as we have said in our hearing statement, it is as part of the transport assessment. And of course, the ongoing monitoring which the council does as part of its annual monitoring.
Because I understand that the issues that the council, that the borough has in relation to air quality is in relation to traffic, isn't it? That's the predominant concern.
Correct.
Okay. Now, I'm not proposing necessarily to go through, I'm not going through any detail through the transport assessment today. And it could be that we need to discuss air quality again from that perspective when we come to discuss matter 12A, which is not until the not next week, the week after, because this is more about the policy wording at the moment. But what I do want to understand is what are the predictions and forecasts for air quality for the end of the plan period, as in where it's going to be. Now, the TA is implying that there will be an impact, a negative impact on air quality, particularly through the 2 transport corridors and the planned growth there. So I'm trying to understand what the implications of that are and the predictions. Obviously, it's not going to be neutral, is my understanding, unless you can tell me that the sustainable measures that are proposed through the plan will ensure that there is a neutral impact. But that doesn't seem to be what the TA is saying, although obviously we can go more into that as part of matter 12A. And then another question is about, has the cumulative impacts of the individual sites been taken into account as part of that assessment of air quality? Excuse me. So my first question is really about what are the predictions for where is the borough going to be in relation to air quality at 2033? Excuse me. That's my first question.
I think this is probably better answered by my other colleague who's been more involved in the transport assessment, and potentially we could sort of leave it to discuss when we come to discuss the transport assessment.
I'm happy to do that, to be fair, if it's going to be easier to discuss those elements and we focus more on just what the policy wording is trying to achieve at this stage. I'm happy to do that, because I think because it is linked with transport. Obviously, anybody here who wants to talk about air quality and does have an issue on transport issues, we will allow you to come into that session as well to discuss that matter, because it could be that there is, because it sounds like it's necessary to go into that session.
Thank you, Inspector. I think that may be helpful on the basis of having our transport consultants to explain the way in which that's been considered through that process. I think we could talk broadly about the locations for where we know there are air quality issues, which, as you said, are mainly driven by literally traffic and the extent to which development or buildings are close to those areas. And I think, as we've sort of gone into before, particularly through the SA process, the way in which that's monitored. But I suspect, in terms of that question about where will we be by the end of the plan period on air quality, that may be best left for us to drill down into the transport assessment.
Okay. Mr. Minot, please.
Yes, thank you, Mum. When looking at this, obviously, it's obvious that you can't disentangle it from the transport situation and therefore the transport assessment, and therefore it's an extremely big issue. However, I think it's worth. I mean, I was from my point of view, I was starting from the phrasing of your question in the MIQs. Does the evidence clearly show that appropriate assessments of the effect of plan growth on traffic levels and air quality have been carried out? And I mean, my answer to that would be an unequivocal no. That's not a reflection on, that's not an argument that there haven't been assessments. There clearly have been assessments. But I think it comes back to the question of appropriateness, and particularly your question on cumulative impact, because it's very obvious when you start looking at the council's air quality presentations that the argument is being made that because you can see headline figures which are coming down in the air quality management areas, this means that there's plenty of slack in the system. You know, we've had worse air quality, therefore there's capacity for further development, therefore there's no issue. And I just think that's hopelessly oversimplistic, and I think there's evidence even in the council's own submissions that that is oversimplistic, and that there is much more to be worried about than that. I mean, I just go back. I think it's worth going back to the point about where the allocated sites are, and the point that I made earlier on about the fact that we have 2 allocated sites which were chosen to be placed right in areas where their air quality their AQMA rating was effectively red. So in my view, that starts asking questions as to why those kinds of locations have been regarded as being acceptable. I mean, why were the AQMAs in the places where they were in? And that was because of exceedances of nitrogen dioxide levels. That means that those were by definition, as it were, danger areas, which suggests that it wasn't a brilliant idea to be proposing new sites in those sorts of places. If you look at some of the specifics in the documentation, you've got one of the things that particularly struck me actually was F18A, the local air quality management annual status report, the 2021, which is July last year. So this is pretty up to date. And I mean, one of the things that particularly struck me in that was what's being said about particulate matter, PM 2.5. Policy guidance LAQM PG 16, local authorities are expected to work towards reducing emissions and or concentrations of PM 2.5. Because that has a clear impact on human health, including premature mortality, allergic reactions, cardiovascular diseases. Brentwood Council does not monitor particulate matter 2.5 concentrations. Brentwood Council is taking measures to address particulate matter 2.5, working with Essex County Council and Highways England to deliver major transport improvement schemes to alleviate congestion. Well, not in terms of new infrastructure. We're not talking about major transport improvement schemes in the town centre where there's an extremely high concentration of proposed development sites. So the point is, the council's not monitoring this at all. At the same time, it's proposing multiple local plan sites, virtually on top of one another in terms of distance from one another in the very areas in which the transport assessment absolutely clearly shows, without getting into the transport assessment in detail at this point, that there are really serious congestion problems being flagged up as a result of those developments. In fact, sites are being placed in locations where there's existing congestion problems. We have existing junctions where the modelling shows that the junctions are already over capacity. So that was the decision process. One of the other things I think it's worth saying is, and again, without going into too much detail on the transport assessment side, there's a whole list of mitigating measures which are being presented in the transport assessment, which we can go through later on. I have to say, when I look at that list, I alternately feel like laughing and crying, because I just don't think it stands up. I wish it would. I wish we lived in that world, but I don't think we do live in that world. I think it's unreal. I think one of the things that's worth saying specifically about particulate matter 2.5 is that, of course, if we move into a world where we've got cars powered by electricity rather than internal combustion engines, there won't be any improvement in terms of particulate matter 2.5. They will still be cars, there will still be vehicles on the roads, they will still be moving backwards and forwards, there will still be a significant issue. So as long as you have a significant number of vehicles on the roads, that will still be the case. So that seems to be a complete, there's a complete black hole in terms of anything that the council's presenting in that area. And this is obviously extremely worrying, given the fact that we've got sites located in areas where there's air quality management issues. I think it's also the case that if you look beneath the headlines of air quality management issues in the town centre, you've got again in F18A, table A2 is showing mean annual NO2 monitoring results. And the headline figures, the presentation is saying, look, this is all fine. You can see the trends in the AQMA areas, they're downwards. This is all good. But when you look at specific sites, there's a number of specific sites where monitoring has taken place. I draw your attention to BRW40 and BRW41, which are both in the High Street. They're towards the western end of the High Street, to the east of the High Street / Weald Road / Kings Road junction. They are both persistently hovering around 40 whatever it is milligrams per square meter. They're not coming down. In recent years, I mean, there's been better years and worse years. They obviously fluctuate, but they're not significantly coming down. They're both at the 40 milligrams level, which is the warning level, the level they shouldn't be at. And the other example, which is not specifically in the town centre, but clearly it will be there will be a significant impact in terms of the amount of traffic generated in the main urban area. BRW5, which is right down at the far end of Brook Street by the roundabout where the junction of the A12 and the M25 is. I mean, those are above those 40 milligrams per square cubic meter in every year between 2015 and 2019, bar 2018. It's clearly a massive issue. It's in the region that it shouldn't be in, and there's absolutely nothing in the local plan that is saying, oh, this is going to improve. It's going to get worse. Congestion will get worse. The amount of traffic that's moving will get worse. Those readings will get worse. Or, as you say, I mean, it's impossible to believe that they'll stay the same. The likelihood surely is that they'll get worse. So, the other thing that really struck me, and again, without going too much into the transport assessment, one of the other things that the transport assessment talks about in terms of, how this is all going to become, although it looks terrible, it's everything's going to come right in the end. We're going to have some kind of, happy ever after here is the, and it's also in F5J, paragraph 5 of F5J. One of the comments is a number of overarching policies supporting the achievement of air quality objectives and a modal shift away from the private car. Now, I'm struck by that wording and that attitude, because we're in a situation at the moment where national government is proposing £27 billion of spending on roads. And one of the arguments that national government is using, I mean, I'm not a massive supporter on spending on roads. I don't drive a car myself. I'm not advocating this, but I'm just highlighting the discrepancy. One of the arguments that the national government is using as to why £27 billion of spending is needed on roads is to combat congestion, and that modal shift to walking and cycling cannot replace most longer journeys and the transport of goods and freight. So essentially what you've got here is Brentwood Council's presenting a local plan which says, oh yeah, it's all fine, there will be a modal shift. National government is saying, no, actually we need to spend enormous amounts on new roads because there won't be a modal shift. Now, obviously, one of the significant things there is in terms of distance of travel, journey distance and things like that. We're getting into details. The point here is that there are significant issues. And actually, I think that the sustainability appraisal throws up, or it underlines the reality of these issues, because although the sustainability appraisal talks about where you focus development, and clearly it's indicated why you shouldn't be focusing the bulk of your development in the town centre, the main urban areas for Brentwood, the reality is that the way in which the various sites have been allocated still means that pretty much half of the development at the time that this was all originally agreed back in 2018, and only slightly less than half now, is still being focused in the transport corridor or in the sort of Brentwood, Shenfield urban areas. And the sustainability appraisal was underlining the dangers of the unsustainable development in those areas. And it talks about very limited benefits to supporting high growth at the Brentwood main urban area and some significant drawbacks, perhaps most notably in respect of air quality. So, I think there's a series of pieces of evidence here that show there's a significant issue. I don't think it's been properly addressed. I don't think the evidence is actually backing up the headline figures, which are purporting to say, oh, this is resolving itself, things are getting better, people are changing their behaviour. I think there's a significant number of pieces of evidence that say that's not the case, and we will obviously talk when we talk about the transport issue in terms of whether the realities of what's going to happen on the ground in terms of the consequences of the compound effect, the cumulative effect of all of these sites is really going to, have a neutral or an acceptable effect. But I think in terms of air quality, and for the reasons I've just said, I think there's already significant reasons to think it won't have a good effect. It won't have a neutral effect. It will have a bad effect, and therefore it's not something that should have been proposed in the local plan.
Mr. Minot, can I just confirm? Are you coming along to the transport infrastructure session?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
You are in that.
You try to keep me away.
No. I was just going to say, because if you weren't, I would like you to attend that session.
Yeah,
That's what I was going to suggest.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I have council respond? I know that there are elements there where we're starting to go into the transport issues that we'll be discussing as part of matter 12A. But does council wish to? I will come to Councillor Phone first, but that if the council can just decide what they wish to comment on in relation to that. But I'll come to Councillor Phone.
I totally support what Mr. Minot has said. I think, however, you need to also consider that approach will extrapolate out to areas that are currently greenbelt but are proposed to be turned into residential development. Places like Dunton Hills Garden Village, they will be remarkably close to the A127, and the A127 is a transport corridor, but it's also a transport area where there are potentially and existingly significant air quality issues. The Dunton Hills Garden Village will increase transport, and therefore you will find that actually you have worse air quality issues in an area that is going to be developed. It needs to be thought through much more carefully, in my humble view.
Thank you, Mr. Phone. Mr. Shadaravian or Mr. Drain?
I think we'll reserve our response until the transport session, Ma'am, if you don't mind.
Okay. Mr. Drain, anything you wanted to add? You were about to speak. No? No. Mr. Shadaravian has taken the words out of your mouth. Right. Thank you. Yes, I don't want to have a discussion on all of that now, and then we repeat and have to go through all of that discussion now. Plus, we haven't got the transport experts in front of us, etc., or the transport professionals. So I'm happy to have that discussion later, not next week, week after. So in our week 4. So thank you for that. Councillor Phone, your hand is still up. Is that a new comment that you wish to make? No. Right. Thank you. So let's have a look at the actual policy wording itself in relation to air quality. And I recognise that the council has put forward some amendments, or some suggested amendments. Excuse me. And these are set out in the hearing statement that now supersede what was set out in F9A. So it would just be useful if the council could just take me through the policy as submitted and the necessary changes that the council think are required for soundness.
The changes have been made to bring the policy more in line with the MPPF, particularly paragraphs 180 and 181, which deal with the location of development, the health of people who will occupy the development, as well as the need to reduce emissions and pollutants. So, as drafted, the policy was considered to be not strong enough in that regard, and indeed some of it, for example, C, development proposals should give equal weight to the consideration of indoor air quality with building design solutions, specifying improving ventilation systems, etc., wasn't effective. It was narrative that didn't impose particular requirements. The policy, as suggested in the Council's response to your questions, is structured in such a way to give effect to the MPPF policy, paragraphs 180 and 181, and imposes requirements in a way which enables the application of the policy at development management stage to be more effectively engaged. So the first part of it, A, development is required to meet national air quality standards and identify opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate local exceedances and impacts to acceptable legal and safe levels, which is appropriate. Development proposals must demonstrate that they will not compromise the achievement of compliance targets in AQMAs, create new exceedance areas, create unacceptable risk of high levels of exposure to poor air quality, particularly where development is near to or promotes land uses to be used by the vulnerable to poor air quality. B deals with design to minimize exposure to existing poor air quality and make appropriate provision to improve local air quality through design solutions and measures to the outdoor and indoor environment, particular attention being given to the positioning, layout and design of proposals for new build developments. And I just might add there that the way in which, for example, housing is laid out and the means of ventilating those houses is something which is recognised now by government, and certainly through the latest publication of Building for Healthy Lives, where modern houses are desperately overheating during the summer months because of poor ventilation. The reliance now on better passive ventilation for the health of occupiers. And section C requires air quality assessments to be provided in relation to major developments, employment developments, and other developments which could impact on air quality. It requires community infrastructure, and that could perhaps be better worded actually, but community buildings, I expect that really means, where residents and others will congregate, to be sufficiently buffered from the effects of pollution, poor air quality, and in relation also to combined heat and power and biomass or similar installations that might impact on air quality, and of course new developments with AQMAs. And D requires consideration of individual and cumulative impacts on air quality. And finally, that those that don't meet the requirements of paragraphs A and B will be resisted unless appropriate measures are implemented to ensure adverse impacts can be mitigated to an acceptable level. That includes on-site mitigation, and if that's inappropriate, such off-site measures as may deliver the required mitigation. So So that essentially is what the policy is trying to achieve. It's trying to make it more effective, to bring it in line with the MPPF, and to meet modern objectives in relation to air quality.
Thank you. Does anybody have any comments on the wording of the policy and the suggested text at this stage? No. Okay.
I do concede that the drafting can be improved in places, but overall, the structure and the substance of the policy, we say, is effective, and in a way in which the existing policy in the deposit draft is not, to give effect to the MPPF requirements.
In relation to the suggested Part C,
yes,
how would cumulative impacts be looked at? I know Part D refers to should have regard to cumulative impacts on air quality, but an air quality assessment, how it's not particularly referenced within that. How would the council look to determine or ensure that development brought forward doesn't have cumulative impacts? How would that be assessed? Is that through the air quality assessment?
Yes, it will be through the air quality assessment and by reference to any current data which the local planning authority holds, or not necessarily the local planning authority, but the council holds, and which the county also may have. But in order to assess the impact of a development or the impact of the environment upon a particular development, it will be necessary to have regard to all sources.
Okay. Thank you. We'll have a look at that wording.
Sorry, Inspector, may I provide just a clarification on that point? In our suggested supporting text, we elaborated a little bit about what should be included in an air quality assessment, and we do make reference to the need to consider the cumulative impacts as well.
Yes, because there's a lot of changes to the supporting text that's proposed on that as well, which I presume is supporting then the changes that are being made, or the suggested changes that are being made to the actual policy itself.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Does anybody have any further questions on air quality? Mr. Minot, please.
Yeah, without going into anything in too much detail, just this point about cumulative effect. I mean, it's something that I've been talking about throughout my involvement with the local plan process, and it's a big concern that I've had. I've felt that there was an issue in terms of the locals plan, the way in which the local plan didn't seem to be considering cumulative effect, particularly where you have got multiple sites which are very close to one another, and essentially all of those sites have to be using, traffic from all of those sites would have to be using the same roads. And one of the things that talking in terms of cumulative effect, one of the issues that it raises is the question of whether cumulative effect has, as it were, been worried about, and a conclusion has been drawn about cumulative effect at the beginning of the process before any developments take place, and even before effectively any site allocations have been chosen, or whether site allocations having been chosen, and let's assume the plan is approved, all of this is in place. You've then got a number of developers who've effectively got their starting pistol fired, and the first couple might be okay because when they do their assessments, the other developments haven't taken place. But once one of them, it depends on which development it might be, but once one of them's taken place, as soon as you start looking at the cumulative effect when somebody else comes along, you start running into a problem. And that seems like if that would be the case, that seems like an extremely bad way of arriving at new developments, because it becomes a running race between developers. They will all want to get in first. If they start thinking there's a danger that when you look at the cumulative impact of new developments, that might start flagging up problems in terms of traffic problems, congestion, air quality. So it's really a question, in my layperson's lack of knowledge about how this works, as to how the question of cumulative impact is effectively treated in the plan, but also would have repercussions in terms of real world developments and the sequence of developments, and as it were, the real world result of one development taking place rather than another one. I just don't know the answer to it, and I'm wondering whether you know the answer to it or whether the council does.
Well, if I can let the thank you, Mr. Minot. If I can let the council respond to that point, I don't know who would like to respond on behalf of the council.
I think Mr. Drain is coming to your assistance.
Thank you.
Apologies. Thank you, Inspector. I think we're circling back round really to nature of the initial questions that are looking at what the strategy is, and therefore how the strategy in terms of cumulative impacts from the perspective of those objecting is unacceptable on the basis that the cumulative impacts supposedly are too great. I think this is where it's a difficult one to square, in the sense that clearly we are looking to focus growth in transport corridors, and by their sustainable nature in relation to access to local services, facilities, public transport, and indeed roads, there is an issue there whereby you are always, as has been picked up both by Mr. Minor in relation to the town centre development, and indeed by Mr. Phone in terms of the Dunton Hills Garden Village development, West Horner development, and the A127, that by their nature they're close to roads. When it comes to cumulative impacts and the specific questions that have just been asked, this is where the concept of and the proposal to continue to monitor the situation would inform a situation in future where, if air quality was a concern, that would be a consideration in terms of the determination of a planning application in that area affecting that area. However, we would come back to the point that the policies in the plan and the way in which we've looked at allocations, their locations, and the way that development should come forward is really to achieve modal shift. And because they are in those sustainable locations, those developments are best placed to achieve that modal shift, regardless of whether anyone thinks that is realistic. The reality is that is the way in which we have to plan if we are to meet development needs. So I would suggest that it is for the continued monitoring of the air quality situation. We're looking, as we've discussed and as points have been made, about increased cars in the area, therefore increased traffic, and for instance, suggestions around national road spending. At the same time, we've got a situation whereby government are shifting, and certainly in policy terms, making sure that electric vehicles, for instance, are more used. And so it may be as much relevant, and I know this is off topic, but as relevant to talk about noise impacts as it is about air quality, on the basis that whilst you've still got the cars and the traffic, the air quality may no longer be as much of an issue in those types of areas. So I think we're looking at a situation that is changing. And those cumulative impacts can only be monitored in the future by doing exactly that, monitoring them, looking at where development is coming forward. And we do not consider that the level of growth that we're proposing here, as we've set out in evidence and documents, papers, that level of growth is sufficient to cause a concern on particular air quality areas.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. I'm proposing that we will come back to discuss this as part of matter 12A in relation to the plan-wide assessment of the impact of the proposed growth and where the borough will be in 2033 in relation to air quality, etc. in that instance. So I think it's probably appropriate that we just leave it there for now in this session. Are there any further questions on the air quality policy at this stage? No. What I'm proposing now is that we take a break, and when we come back, I'd like to come back and look at NE06 first, which is on the flood risk policy. So can we take a 20-minute break, please? Would that be acceptable for everybody? If we're back at 11:20 then, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Before we move on to NE06, I just wanted to clarify that discussion on NE05. There are some queries and questions in relation to some of the wording on that policy and in relation to the supporting text. However, what I would like to do is discuss that as part of under matter 12A, because I think it's going to be more appropriate, because having had those discussions on transport in its totality may then have further implications for the air quality policy, etc. So I'd rather have, that's why we haven't raised those questions, those particular questions now. Now, if there is anybody who in relation to attending this session wishes to attend that session, you are more than welcome. So if you can just contact the council, Ms. Feeney, then we will ensure that you are admitted to the 12A session. Okay, because I want to ensure that that nobody is prejudiced in any way whatsoever, because we want to hear from people in relation to that. So just bear with us on that. So can we move to policy NE06, please, which is on flood risk. Now, our question 195 in our MIQs seeks to determine whether the policy on flood risk is sound and the approach in the plan on flood risk is sound, and whether this policy, NE06, is justified by the supporting text that is set out within the plan. Now, the council, again, has suggested some changes to this policy. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean, and I think I did reiterate all this at the beginning, so I just want to reiterate again, these are council suggested changes. It doesn't mean that we will take them on board at all. It's whether any changes are necessary for soundness. So I will again just reiterate that. I did make that very clear at the beginning of week one. So there are a lot of changes to lots of policies that have been suggested by the council, some of them quite rightly so. Other ones we will be looking at in a bit more detail as we continue to go through the sessions, etc. Now, you've put forward in relation to NE06, I'll just get the right section up, in the hearing statement, further changes that now, do these supersede the ones that were set out in F9A?
They do, Mum, yes.
Okay. So again, it's going to be a very similar question of, are those changes necessary because you consider that the NE06 policy is unsound, and therefore for soundness reasons, for justification or effectiveness or consistency with national policy, changes are necessary, or whether these are improvements to the policy and therefore aren't necessary for soundness.
We think they're necessary to bring the policy in line with national guidance, to make it effective, and also to focus the property more properly on the issue of flood risk rather than drainage, which can be dealt with under other parts of the plan. So as we suggested in our response to question 195, the changes account for critical drainage areas referred to in the existing clause or paragraphs B and F being more relevant to sustainable drainage and alleviating surface water flooding, and it's proposed that appropriate clauses are decoupled from this policy and incorporated into BE08 on sustainable drainage with references to link the policies. Paragraph B needs to make clear that development will only be permitted if proposals have satisfied the sequential and exception tests, etc. And clause paragraph C relates to the general design measures that are best described by supporting text, as there are any number of appropriate mitigation strategies that might be employed in relation to the development. And clause D, paragraphs D and E relate to wastewater management issues, which require separate attention. So it's suggested that these are incorporated into a new policy to deal with water management and efficiency. The amendments are therefore much more focused. They will be much more effective, but they will be effective in the way the existing policy probably wouldn't be, in terms of managing flood risk, with criteria that is much more precise, follows national guidance, and although I know the county have some observations in relation to this proposed these proposed modifications, that align also with the county's requirements.
So just before I forget, on one of the points that you've just raised, so that I don't forget to just clarify, the point you've made about wastewater management issues needing for a new policy, which you're proposing, water management and efficiency. Is that then going to be a strategic policy and specified as such?
Yes, it will be. It would have general application.
So in relation to our question 195, can you just take us through responses to those questions, taking into account your suggested changes to the policy? Because obviously now you're proposing to amend certain aspects of, well, it's been suggested that certain aspects of the policy are amended, particularly in relation to the justification for the policy, what the policy is trying to achieve in relation to flood risk. You've obviously brought in the sequential and the exception tests.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to ask Ms. Polaris to deal with this because she has been in direct conversations with other stakeholders, including the County Council. That'd
be really useful to just see the approach that the Council is now making on flood risk. Thank you.
Certainly, thank you. So in order to address your first point about sort of the paragraph A-D, we felt that it was necessary to redraft that statement to ensure that it's clear that that development should avoid all flood risk areas unless they meet the sequential and exception test, and that needed to be stated up front. And so then that leads on to the next clause, which makes much clearer when a specific site flood risk assessment is needed, and the sub-criteria there picks up on some of the criteria that we had already included, but in addition reflects the recommendations that came out of the strategic flood risk assessment, which is evidence document C16. And then C, whereas before we were essentially only referring to areas designed in functional floodplains and critical drainage areas should meet the following, we felt that didn't reflect what national policy prescribes, and what we actually say here, that if we are satisfied that the proposals meet the sequential and exception tests, then we expect the design proposals to meet the following criteria. Again, the following criteria reflect a national guidance, as well as recommendations that came out from the strategic flood risk assessment. We still do refer to critical drainage areas and suggest that they refer back to policy BE08 just for completeness, so that everything regarding surface water flooding is addressed there. We, as already described, we deleted the detail about what kind of flood mitigation measures might be needed, because we felt that's more supporting text type issues, and instead we just have a general clause that says that appropriate mitigation measures must be incorporated, looking at flood resistant and flood resilient design measures. And then finally, the final clause, as I just said, relates back to BE08, which is on sustainable drainage. I hope I've answered your question, but that's the general approach. So it starts high level in terms of we want you to avoid flood risk. Where you have shown that this is to be avoided, then you essentially need to follow national guidance on what can be put where in terms of vulnerability classes and suitability. When we require a site-specific flood risk assessment in order to be informed about making the decision, and then relate back to BE08 for dealing with surface water issues. And as we already said, decoupled the issues on surface water, sewage and wastewater management into a new policy.
So can I just clarify that relevant statutory consultees have been involved in that wording?
So we spoke earlier this week.
I'm getting some nods from the County Council.
Essentially, my colleague, Mr. Simpson, would like to further elaborate, but we went through the wording and they were happy with the wording of the flood risk policy. Some suggested changes were raised in relation to our supporting text, and we are happy to address those just to ensure that they are completely in alignment with the policy.
It would be useful to have the county's sort of take on this in relation to understanding the council's approach to flood risk, and then I will bring in anybody else who wants to make comments on this. So is that Mr. Simpson or Ms. Yousaf?
Yeah, I'll comment if that's right, Inspector. Yeah, I don't think there's an awful lot in addition to what Kay's added that we can add, other than that we have had those conversations with Brentwood, and we are satisfied that the changes that they're proposing still match the outcomes of the originally agreed text. We understand that the changes are to direct issues around surface water to policy BE08 and sustainable drainage, which we agree is an appropriate place to address those points.
So so from the County Council's perspective, you're content that the suggested wording that the council's put forward provides clarity in relation to flood risk in the Brentwood Borough?
We are.
Okay. Thank you. Does anybody have any comments that they wish to make on the policy? Obviously, we will look in that in more detail. Mr. Phone, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much. West Horton Council has a significant problem with some of the issues that arise here. They are locally based, but I believe that they extrapolate across Brentwood and indeed possibly across Essex too. Flooding, as the world realises, takes no notice of local authority areas, of no notice of local development plans or anything else. It just does what it does, and it certainly doesn't apply for planning permission to do it. And if it does what it does, it takes no notice to the enforcement officer. We can only do flood risk and appropriate drainage if we understand fully the systems that are in place in an area. And unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily correspond with the area where a development is proposed to take place, because, as I say, the water goes where the water goes. Now, we have issues here because I'm afraid Essex County Council have told me that they don't have detailed records of certain incidents that have occurred, and therefore they are in a difficult position to be able to comment on some of the proposed applications, because they're in a difficult position about how they do the risk assessment, because they don't have the data, and for reasons I don't know or don't understand. But I had meetings on the 31st of July 2019 with officers, and they were very clear that some of the major issues where properties were flooded in West Horndon, they didn't have any data on it. Now, at the present minute, the consultation takes place between the Essex surface water flood area. In other circumstances, it would take place with the with the Environment Agency, etc. But when I make a comment about something that I have seen in real life, I'm told it's not considered, it's just considered as hearsay. But what I would like to see in the policy for Brentwood for certain, applying to here, and I don't see why it shouldn't apply in other places as well, is that the policy actually opens up to consultation with other responsible bodies who can actually inform the situation by telling people what has actually happened on the ground and in people's living rooms and their hallways and their bedrooms, so that they actually have a better understanding. And that doesn't seem to be part of this policy as far as I can see. Now, I've openly confessed that I may well not have caught up on the recent changes that have been made, but about that I apologise. I'm sorry, I can't. We are just a small parish council. We don't have the resources to keep going into things. But I think this is really important. If you have had your house flooded or things like that, it is devastating. There is nothing else to say other than it is devastating. And I do ask the inspector to consider whether or not something can be done about changing the wordings of these policies so that responsible bodies in the area are able to help inform the decisions that are made. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just confirm, Mr. Phone, the parish council is on the list where you are asked to comment on planning applications, is that correct?
That is indeed correct. We are statutory consultees, but we are in the unfortunate situation that, and I've had it said to me by officers, that because Essex County Council didn't acknowledge or bring anything up, our evidence was considered as hearsay.
Thank you, Mr. Phone. I'm going to bring in Mr. Ratcliffe, and then I'll come to the council for comments on that. Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. First of all, a little bit of context, if I may, just for those that aren't familiar with the flooding issues in Brentwood. Although we do consistently send in photos to Mr. Drain, Chris Hossack and others. But if I just use Blackmore as an example, I mean, the word Blackmore in ancient English is bog, because we sit in a basin, a bowl. So we suffer not only from surface water drainage from all the fields. We're surrounded by greenbelt, as you know, but also fluvial flooding, because the River Wid that eventually winds its way into Chelmsford and joins up the River Chelmer, rises just north of Blackmore. And in fact, in Redrose Lane, where site R26 is proposed, there's a confluence of at least one of the tributaries of the river, plus drainage ditches that have become rivers. So basically 3 streams converge at the Chelmsford Road end of Redrose Lane, supposed to go underneath the road, but frequently goes over the top of the road, as you've probably seen from the photos. And the river then proceeds southwards to the pond, and the pond overflows, and it overflows significantly. So we've put photographs in all of our Homes and Hills representations, hearing position statements, starting with the great flood we had in 1987, which was absolutely monumental. It was the year that I actually moved into Blackmore. But we literally had boats and fire engines rescuing people from their homes. You know, so to endorse what the councillor from West Horndon is saying, you know, this is actual life-risking events. People were trapped in their homes. We'd also like to flag the frequency of the flooding. I mean, this is very, very frequent. You've seen the most recent photos that we put in the hearing position statement in December. And just to put it into further context, I think you'll recall on the day that I first spoke at one of these hearing sessions, which was the 4th of December, so literally 2 days after the examination commenced, I had to take about a 30-minute detour out of Blackmore because we were cut off from the north, the east and the south. So for my journey to Braintree, I had to go out southwards round the village, more or less into Ongar to get out. So these are the flooding instances. So the 4th of December, the village was totally cut off, and the
Mr. Ratcliffe, can I just ask what we have the evidence that you've submitted from Homes and Hill.
Yeah.
So what is it that you want changed in relation to this policy?
I think I'm endorsing what West Horndon are saying, that there has to be a reality beyond flood risk assessments undertaken remotely by people that don't have this local knowledge, because, you know, just since this commenced, 4th of December, 14th of December, 27th of December, 14th of January, 19th of January, 27th, 28th, 30th of January and the 7th of February, Redrose Lane was flooded to the extent that if you can picture an ambulance being called from Broomfield Hospital, come down the Chelmsford Road towards Blackmore, attempt to turn right into Redrose Lane, and it won't be passable unless it has a lifeboat on board. So the issue is, you know, this is potentially a life-threatening event if this policy isn't widened to undertake a more detailed flood risk assessment rather than leave it to individual assessments when sites come forward for planning consent. It's a major, major issue. So I think the point I'm making is that not enough work has been done before this policy is written in tablets of stone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. Can I ask the council to respond to the points that Mr. Fone and Mr. Ratcliffe have made, please?
Of course, Mum. We do, of course, take all observations and objections seriously. The fact of the matter is, Brentwood Council has to be guided by those who are responsible for providing the technical expertise in defining flood zone areas and advising the council as to flood risk. And within Brentwood, actually, there's very little in the way of rivers or streams that give rise to flood risk. So the Environment Agency is not engaged in any major way in this technical work. So we rely very substantially on the county for the provision of that advice and to guide development. And that's as far as we can go.
May I add something?
Yes.
So on the point about our existing evidence, the existing evidence does indeed highlight the issues at Blackmore and West Horndon. The surface water management plan does highlight areas which have experienced surface water flooding, and I believe our policy amendments do ensure that those are taken into consideration when the site flood risk assessments are being carried out. So we are by no means blind to the issues, and they are already referenced in the evidence base.
And when you say that the changes to the policy make that clear that this will be taken into consideration, can you point me to the specific part of the suggested changes where you set that out?
So in relation to the flood risk policy, because that deals more with the flood sort of flood risk zones.
Are you talking more about BE08?
Yes.
Okay.
So that deals more with the surface water flooding issues that are being highlighted at Blackmore and West Horndon. But just to reassure, the clause B, which sets out more clearly when we require a site-specific flood risk assessment, and it does include areas over 1 hectare within flood zone 1. So that's in areas that do not necessarily show a flood risk issue, but because of the surface water and drainage issues, then that's a requirement there. So it is asking development to undertake the necessary assessments and ensure that any proposed land uses, etc., follow national guidance.
Thank you. Mr. Ratcliffe, you've got your hand up. Is that a further comment, or?
Yes, it is. I understand that. I've read through all of the documentation, but there's a step before this. Just to reiterate, we are talking about a river. It's called the River Wid, and it's actually a fairly significant river that flows initially southwards and then back northwards towards Chelmsford, and it carries a hell of a lot of water in it. So the issue in Blackmore isn't just surface water, it's exacerbated by surface water, but this is fluvial flooding, and it's significant. And it's that significant that I don't believe the policy is strong enough to say, let's wait for individual planning applications to make that assessment. And I think Essex County Council need to be charged with doing further research before this policy is passed.
Mr. Simpson, please.
Just to clarify that Essex County Council are not the authority that are responsible for fluvial flood risk. Our remit only extends to surface water flood risk, and I understand it that the conversations today are in relation to planning policy specific to new development rather than the points around the gathering of background evidence. I appreciate obviously that background evidence is important when we're making those decisions. However, all of the drainage authorities, ourselves and the environment agencies in particular, have limited resources. So the way that is addressed nationally is that although we have a significant body of evidence around existing flood risk, there will be some local gaps. The principles we take are that any new development must ensure that it doesn't increase flood risk elsewhere, and we will assess each of those major applications individually to ensure that is the case. However, we aren't in a position to ask the developers to go beyond that to address issues that might already be existing, other than areas where we've identified there is a particularly critical risk, identified as part of critical drainage areas within the surface water management plans, where we have asked for consideration of individual mitigation strategies on particular development parcels to address some of those issues.
Thank you. Councillor Phone, please.
Yes, just to come in on that, I totally understand that the Environment Agency and the Essex Surface Water Flood Team are fully under-resourced in terms of being able to provide data across the board. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that there is and it's almost free resource, and that is local bodies who know what happens in their area. They are there every day and they see what happens. And therefore, if you are prepared to consult with us rather than just ignore us, we are in a position to be able to actually help you to help the wider community. And a policy should be in place to make sure that that actually happens. And that's what I'm trying to offer. I'm trying to help, not to be awkward or difficult. I really do understand what the issues are, and I am trying to help. I know that certain developers won't consider it as helpful if we point out that their fields that they want to build on are covered in water and have been already significantly twice this year. But that's helping the community, not the commercial interests. And that's what I want to do, is to help the community. Thank you.
I'll come to you in a moment, Mr. Ratcliffe. Is there anybody else who wants to talk on this issue? Because I'm proposing to move on after I've listened to Mr. Ratcliffe and then had a council response. So is anybody else? Okay. So Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Thanks again. And just to echo the previous speaker's comments, we would do the same. We have many photo albums that clearly identify exactly how bad this risk is. And just to add to that, the flooding in Red Rose Lane has actually been worsened by the building of the site on Red Rose Farm, which is on the high side of Red Rose Lane. So you can actually see the water running through the expanded drainage ditches that now flows over the road and creates a second flood, or the River Wid flood. So we have evidence of exactly what building on fields leads to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. Can I have a council response, please?
Yes, very briefly. The proposed paragraph B, subparagraph D, requires an FRA for new development or a change of use to more vulnerable classes, which may be subject to other sources of flooding, so that would include fluvial.
Thank you. Right, I'm proposing to move off policy NE06 and move on to policy NE07, please. Thank you. Now, this is the contaminated land and hazardous substances policy. So can the council just explain the purpose of the policy and then set out how it accords with the appropriate paragraphs in the framework in relation to ground conditions and pollution? So you've got 178, 179 and 183.
The policy, I think, as proposed to be amended, is fairly straightforward in terms of the harms which are intended to be avoided or eliminated. I'll ask Ms. Polaris to give you the background to the policy.
Thank you.
So what we have what we hope to achieve by the slight reordering and changes to the policy is to ensure that, as sort of raised in paragraph 178, that we deal with issues of ground contamination slightly separately from other hazardous materials, so that we make very clear that one consideration is to ensure that ground contamination is taken into account and the necessary assessments are done to inform the application. And the second part of the policy deals more specifically with the location of hazardous substances on site, which again, if you consider paragraph 180, it's also about ensuring that vulnerable uses are not located near to sites where such substances are located. So I think we've made that a little bit clearer in the proposed modifications.
Thank you.
Highlighting the sort of to ensure that there is no unacceptable risk to human health, safety, or the environment. And that's the bit that links directly back to the international guidance and our policy.
So by separating it out, you're making the policy more effective.
Correct, yes.
And ensuring that it meets and is consistent with national policy in that respect.
Correct.
What is it clear what is meant by, I'm looking at part D, what is meant by a hazardous installation? Is that clearly set out in your supporting text?
Hazardous installation, I believe, is defined in the guidance on HSA. But if not, we can certainly ensure that the supporting text elaborates on what we mean by that.
And does this... Sorry, go on, carry on, sorry.
From memory, it can also include things like sort of gas holders, but also anything that's holding chemicals and other such.
Do you have such hazardous installations in Brentwood?
I have to admit, I don't know.
That's fair enough. at least you're honest.
I think.
So I'm trying to understand the purpose of why that needs to be added if you haven't already got any.
Well, we don't have any, but who knows? We might have during the course of the lifetime of the plan. Who knows?
It's more likely to be in relation to our employment land sites, but I am not, as you know, not totally aware of.
But in relation to hazardous installations, that's also covered by, contaminated land in and pollution in that sense, and hazardous substances is covered by other regulations and other legislation. Correct. Anyway.
Correct.
So again, is it because the purpose of, and I think it's in paragraph 183 of the framework, it's about the focus of planning policies is not about process. So I'm just trying to, it's not about sort of controlling processes. So you're not proposing that through the suggested changes that are set out in the policy, are you? Because obviously that's controlled by
process regulations.
Okay. Exactly. Absolutely.
So may I suggest that we relook at that and ensure that just clause C covers everything that's needed and required from a planning point of view. In relation to process, that could certainly go into supporting text just to give the broader context.
It doesn't necessarily need to go in there because it is covered by other regulations and other legislation.
Yes.
So I'm not necessarily proposing that it would need to go in there. I'm just ensuring that what's in policy NE07 is necessary for planning purposes and doesn't duplicate other regulations or other, the Environmental Protection Act requirements, etc., etc. So it's just making sure that there isn't duplication, really, because it's.
We'll make sure there's
if
no
you can, that'd be really useful. I'm going to bring in. Sorry.
Just in essence, that there are planning. These issues do have planning significance in terms of the way in which a proposal is designed, laid out, or situated within any given site. So there is a need for these kinds of controls, as it were, aside from parallel regimes which deal with safety.
Thank you. Mr. Phone, your comments on this policy.
You asked the question, are there any hazardous substances in use around? I don't know about now, but certainly historically there have been hazardous substances used on what is the existing West Horndon industrial estate, and those would need to follow the process that has been outlined to make sure that we are clear. But this Brentwood has had industrial activity that does use hazardous substances.
Thank you, Mr. Phone. Does anybody else have any comments on policy NE07 that they wish to add? Okay. Thank you. So if the council can just have a look at that again, just to make sure that it's not including any sort of regulatory processes. I don't think it is, but it would be useful to just get that clarity.
Will do.
Thank you. Can I then move on to the final policy that we're looking at in this session, which is policy NE08, which is floodlighting and illumination. And our questions were generally about whether this policy is sound and justified. Now, the purpose of the policy as it's written, because the council, bear with me. Now, as it's written in the submitted text, I recognise that the council in F9A, you're not proposing any further suggestions to amend it in your hearing statement, but in F9A there are some suggested wording changes. And again, I would just like to understand whether these are just improving what the policy is trying to achieve, or whether they are necessary for soundness. And then I want to understand how this would relate to specific uses. And I'm thinking more potentially on the large strategic employment sites, for instance, because I know that has been raised by participants. Well, I don't think they're in the room today, but by representors. So it's how that would relate. I'm thinking about particularly the biggest, like, E11, for instance, which is the largest strategic employment site that's proposed, how this would relate and whether it should, the criteria should relate to all development proposals, because that's what the policy says. So can you just take me through, just very succinctly, the changes that you propose?
The changes sorry. The
or that you suggest, yes. I should say.
The changes being suggested are done so to make the policy more effective. It's not as effective as it should be, in our view, at the moment. So the changes are actually quite simple. I'll come on to deal with the impact on economic or employment development, particularly on large sites, in a moment. So it's suggesting that development proposals involving floodlighting or other means of illumination will be permitted where the scheme is appropriate for the intended use and has been appropriately designed to prevent light spillage. That's a lighting scheme. Is energy efficient, provides minimum level of light necessary to achieve its purpose, uses an appropriate light spectrum, etc. And the addition is to focus on current concerns about night sky, and sky glow. Yes.
Sorry, can I just ask whether that's consistent with paragraph 180 of the framework, part C, which talks about limiting impact of light pollution, including intrinsically dark landscapes, etc.
No, it's not, and I was going to come on to say that it's not flexible enough.
Yeah.
So it should say it should not unacceptably impact. So that gives then discretion to the decision maker to consider, one, the nature of the development and what that would require in terms of a lighting scheme, and also to understand that in all cases it will not be possible entirely to eliminate impacts on the night sky or any increase in sky glow, because quite clearly a development like that envisaged in Brentwood Enterprise Park is going to have to be lit during the night time, because it will be a 24, one assumes it will be 24 hours in operation. Moreover, it's located close to a major junction on the M25, which itself emits a huge amount of light at night time. So that the night sky there is not one that can be easily preserved in any event. So we need that flexibility, and so it should read, does not unacceptably impact on the night sky, or give rise to unacceptable increase in sky glow.
Thank you.
My understanding is that the promoters of Brentwood Enterprise Park were concerned about these proposed changes on that basis, and agree that that formulation is more appropriate. And that would, of course, apply then to all proposals that come forward.
And in terms of the other changes that are suggested under F, you want to include some reference to character and design of the development in relation to the area. You're talking about visual amenity, so giving clarity
that's right.
on that.
That's right. Because depending upon the lighting scheme, as we know, they can impact very adversely at night time on the character and design of development, if not sympathetically designed and integrated into the development.
Do you need to specify that conditions may be imposed?
No, I don't think we do.
It's not a policy. It doesn't have to be set out in policy, because that's something that the council can do anyway. It's not necessarily an issue being in the policy. It's not necessarily a soundness issue.
It's a matter of standard development management procedure, so we can take that up.
Okay, great, thank you. Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Just a question about criterion F and looking at the way in which the council is proposed to amend it. I just wonder whether something has been lost. And I just throw the question in about whether there is sufficient reference to or protection to, for example, what we would call the living conditions of neighbouring residents, because very often it is that the impact from floodlighting can impact on residential properties, and there's a removal of residential areas from criterion F, and I just wonder whether actually there needs to be something in there, if that is what the council sees as important, just to make that clear.
So I think it does need to be in there, you're quite right. So those words can be added.
Thank you.
On that particular point as well, obviously relevance of light pollution to nature conservation, particularly certain species, can be quite decimating to a population in terms of changing habits, etc. So in looking at that, can you mention that? Because obviously you've taken out reference to sites of nature conservation interest.
Yeah.
It's not just about sinks. It's also about wildlife in general.
Yes.
In terms of nature conservation.
We can put that in.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Is there anything else that anybody wants to raise in relation to that particular policy, NE08? Because I'm proposing that we move on now and we finish this session. So thank you. So again, if you can just give me just a couple of minutes to sort out my papers. So can I just suggest I will be back online because I just need to get my papers. They're over there. I'll be back online at 15:15. So just a 2-3 minute, just quick adjournment. Thank you. Right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That just aided my shifting my paperwork around, so thank you for that. I want to now come on to 13F. So this is sustainable construction and resource efficiency, and we're specifically looking at policies BE02 and 2 BE08. Now, the only participants coming into this session are Essex County Council. You've already introduced yourselves, so I'm not proposing that you need to introduce yourselves again. So we'll just move straight in to look at some of these policies. Now, turning to the Council's hearing statement, there are significant changes to the majority of the policies that you've suggested need to be changed. And I suppose our first question is, why do those changes need to be made? You submitted the plan stating that the policies were sound and the plan was sound, but then there's a very large, significant change to including the creation of new policies that we're trying to understand. So it's really taking us back to what the submitted plan actually says and what is necessary for soundness reasons. What is it that these policies don't deliver in relation to soundness, so that you have to basically rewrite them? Because I certainly agree that certain aspects do need to be either amended or changed to ensure that there is consistency with national policy and that they are effective, etc. So, for instance, why is it necessary to create a new policy that we haven't asked for? This new BE01. And what's the purpose of that? What's that trying to achieve? So, because I know that the existing BE01 future-proofing, as we discussed yesterday, as we'll discuss this afternoon, is proposed to be deleted. Obviously, we would discuss that there. So this is a new sustainable design policy. So if the council can just explain their reasoning behind this, and so that we can understand why it's necessary, why it has to be set out in a new policy, why it's not already covered within the plan or aspects already in the plan. So it's really the council's approach. So I'm not quite sure who would like to start on that.
I'm happy to start.
Yes, please, Ms. Polaris.
So I would suggest that it's not necessarily a brand new policy. It's taking elements from the existing policy BE03. And the reason for the suggestion was really to ensure that policy was easier to read and easier to apply, so make it a bit clearer about its intention. The clauses could easily remain in the existing policy and ensure that the title therefore reflects what the policy contains. The idea of bringing it into a new policy was to focus the attention on the requirements for sustainable construction in terms of energy efficiency. Especially in thinking that when we proposed to remove BE01, whose intention was initially to set the framework for how sustainable construction and development comes forward, we felt that it required that overall setting the scene, if you like, especially as we have the table in terms of what we require for the sustainability statement, and we discussed this in policy BE03, but it doesn't come in until clause D, and felt that that needed to be sort of set out up front in order to frame what is required from development and how it should consider all the elements of sustainable development. and the subsequent policies which follow.
So nothing that's set out in here is new.
So
is that correct? So as you said, you're pulling aspects out of other policies, potentially. That's your suggestion.
Correct.
But your part B, aren't those aspects, or aren't they all just covered by other policies anyway? So the requirement for net gain, we'll be discussing that under the NEO
you are
policies.
correct. It is.
Flood risk assessment, we've just dealt with that one. That's NEO 6. Air quality assessment, that's under NEO 5. So what's the purpose of this policy?
It was well, that part isn't necessarily needed. It was just set out in the supporting text that those are required in addition to the sustainability statement to highlight the sustainability appraisal aspects of things that's also required. However, it's also set out in our table, figure 5.1. So it's really just to highlight that what we require here in terms of the sustainability statement is in addition to what might be required as a result of other things that we quite rightly we also mention in other policies. However, as the plan is meant to be read as a whole, it's not necessarily needed to repeat here.
Because I was going to come on to your 5.1 table.
Yeah.
And this is guidance. It's not a requirement, is it?
Correct.
Okay.
It's to guide what should be addressed by the sustainability statement.
Okay. So that's absolutely fine in terms of guidance. I just wanted clarity on that. Okay, can we have a look at BO2? What I want to do is try and, because I'm not convinced at this stage that it's necessary to have an overarching policy. That's unless there is something needed as a strategic policy relating to design, but that was to do with design, not just to do with sustainable design and all-encompassing matters. And that's something we can look at. Oh, sorry, that's something that we will consider as to whether that's necessary. At the moment, I'm not, I want to understand what the policies say in relation to sustainable construction and resource efficiency, and then determine whether the vast majority of the suggestions, and obviously the council's just put them forward as suggestions at this stage, whether they do make the policies more effective, provide greater clarity, etc., etc., and where justification text is supposed to be amended as well, whether that provides greater justification for the proposals that are set out. So can we just understand BO2? It's rather tricky because dealing with BO2 as it's in the submitted plan is actually quite different to what's in the suggested proposals, the suggested changes. So it's starting to get, I know that it's recommended that BEO2 is deleted, but I want to understand why BEO2 is deleted and understanding whether the elements that are set out there are actually sound, because you in submitting the plan, you've said those elements are sound. So
that's correct. And
I'm just getting confused now.
At a high level, the statements essentially are considered in all other subsequent policies, hence why we have suggested it's deleted. So, for example, the first statement A is about ensuring that development considers energy efficiency, and that's in BE03. The second one ensures that we consider climate change as part of it. Well, that's implicit or explicit in all policies, and I'm not sure that a statement on its own there adds anything to what's already in existence in other policies. C is about how it demonstrates water conservation measures, and as we've already stated, we have proposed extracting all the requirements and statements with regards to water conservation, water efficiency and water management into its own policy so that it's all in one place and easy to follow. Clause D is about incorporating sustainable drainage systems. Well, that's already Clause A in BE08. So as you can see, it's already largely high-level statements that's repeated as requirements in other policies. So we felt it didn't necessarily add anything. Although they are all relevant and all are requirements, they don't add anything extra to what's already required in the existing subsequent policies.
Okay, so then take me through the, let's have a look again. Let's have a look at BE03 that's in the submitted plan. And then
so
obviously you're proposing to take out the water efficiency measures, and obviously that will be something for us to consider as to whether that is necessary or not for effectiveness. So you're proposing to take the table out
and simplify it as statements. So the content of the table now just becomes statements, if you like, or requirements as part of.
So you're not changing anything within it.
No, we're not changing the amounts we're asking for or the intent of the policy. Those remain. It's just no longer a table. It's just statements. The only thing that is changing is we suggested that up to 2020 we want this, and then 2020 onwards we require something different. Now, given the time frame, we decided that that's
yes, I understand that. Yeah.
In addition, the table provided, if you like, a little bit more detail and broke down what the excellence rating meant, but we felt that that wasn't necessarily necessary, and that just that the high level requirement is in there, and the guidance, that kind of information is already in the guidance and unnecessary to repeat here.
So in relation to the difference between residential and non-residential, you don't consider that that's necessary?
No, that's not what I think I said. It's
so in relation to Part B at the moment, as the policy is at the moment, there's a separation between new residential development and non-residential development, and the requirements are different.
So I have to remind myself what we've actually done. I'm not sure if my colleague also wants to assist here, because
yeah, I'm looking at the policy as redrafted in F9A and the new hearing statement, so bear with me a minute. No, ma'am, so if we, some respects of the policy where it sets out the difference between residential and non-residential requirements is still retained. So for example, when we look at water efficiency, and I'm looking at the hearing statement here, it still separates the difference between what new residential development would be required and what non-residential development would be required. And for example, with regards to BREEAM standards, then in BE01, we still retain that. So new non-residential developments will still need to achieve the excellence rating under the BREEAM construction standard.
I have to admit, this is just all over the shop.
Yeah.
It's exceptionally
Mark,
confusing and it's very hard to follow. And as you can probably guess, I'm getting rather frustrated with this.
Mom, can I make a suggestion?
Yes, please, Mr. Shadowraven.
This was intended to rationalise the policies and to eliminate repetition or duplication of certain aspects of the policies, and it was done so with the positive intention of trying to assist in terms of the way in which the plan is structured. And I myself am finding this very difficult to follow. I have no doubt at all that it must be extremely frustrating for you in trying to follow this. It seems to me that looking at the scheme of this part of the plan and the way in which the policies are intended to work, that the basis of the policies, although there is some duplication which can easily be dealt with through amendments to the policies, that the scheme of the policies is basically sound, subject perhaps to some drafting changes that improves the effectiveness of the policies and avoids duplication. And in the Council's submitted F9A responses, some changes were proposed in order to make the policies more effective.
They were,
so
yes.
They communicated better, they were more certain in their requirements. I think what's happened since then is that there's been an attempt to reorganize, to make the structure of this part of the plan perhaps easier to follow. But I think what's happened actually overall is that it's just caused terrible confusion, despite the positive intention. So my suggestion is actually that we should go through the submitted draft plan and look at the requirements there, and if there is a need, and to look at the F9A proposed changes, and if there is a need to amend any of these policies, then we do so, and therefore to ignore the Council's response.
To ignore the hearing statement, really.
Yeah, to ignore it, because otherwise we're going to end up in an almighty mess and maybe not actually get through this session.
We will get through this session because I will be stopping it in 27 minutes. So
Right.
we will be finishing it.
I'm suggesting, I'm sure actually that there's very little in these policies that is in any way controversial. So I'm going to suggest that we stick to the
I think you are probably correct there, Mr. Shadowravian, and that's what my concern is, that things are being changed to improve the plan, which obviously the council can do when it comes to its next plan. But let's just try and look at the policies that are here before us. So
okay, and also have F9A just to assist.
Yeah, I have that before me.
Okay. So policy BE02, the suggested amendments are there to make the policy more effective, to maximise the principles of energy conservation and efficiency in the design and layout. There was no need to refer to massing, siting and orientation, because those could mean, massing could mean any number of things, and I'm not sure what relevance massing has. Exactly, it's all in design and layout.
Mm-hmm.
And use of materials, and of course construction methods, which is of course extremely important when one is looking at sustainable construction. the B was taken out. Submit details of measures that increase resilience to the threat of climate change, but not limited to summer. Very, very little meaning, and I think is dealt with elsewhere anyway. B, incorporate water conservation measures, very straightforward requirement, and increase the use or reuse of aggregates. And include, as was before, include commercial and domestic scale renewable energy and decentralized energy. So those are changes just to bring clarity, certainty, and greater effectiveness to the policy. They don't change the substance of the policy.
Shall we move on to BE03 then?
Yes.
Thank you. And again, Mr. Shadaravian or whomever in the council team, if you can just take me through the changes. I understand getting rid of the up to 2020. That makes perfect sense because we're 2021. So if you can just explain the changes there.
Yes, we've introduced at least a 10% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions above the requirements of Part L of the building regulations until the future home standard is introduced in line with national zero carbon policy. So that's keeping things up to date.
That's for residential development. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. For non-residential development, we've gone to BREEAM Excellent to be achieved, and again, at least a 10% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. And a requirement for water management measures, including the use of grey water harvesting. So those are to bring the requirements up to date. And then C, those changes are there for clarity and also flexibility, which makes the policy more effective. Again, these are minor changes, but they do assist in achieving greater clarity. So in addition to the above, for major developments and where feasible, applications will be required to provide a minimum. That shouldn't be applications, it should be proposed developments will be required to provide a minimum of 10% of energy needs from renewable sources, and proposed developments, including redevelopment of existing floor space, should be accompanied by a sustainability statement. And D introduces a little bit of flexibility. It is not possible, if it's not possible to meet the standards, applicants must demonstrate compelling reasons and provide evidence as to why. So that brings in some flexibility.
Okay, thank you.
And so on and so forth. It's really to bring it up to date and to bring it in line with current expectations at national level. So I would suggest actually that the F9A proposed amendments are entirely appropriate and necessary for the better effectiveness of the policy.
Thank you, Mr. Shadaravian. So can we, obviously we'll look at those in a bit more detail, and if we obviously we'll consider the suggested changes there. Policy BE04 then. Now, in relation to what's set out in Part A, is the final part. I know that as part of your F9A, you've proposed instead of encouraged but permitted in there. Is the element related, because you reference including on the green belt, is that consistent with paragraph 147 of the framework?
We don't need a reference to the green belt in there. Makes no difference to the substance of this policy whatsoever.
Thank you. So that can be taken out. And then the suggested changes that you've put in. So what is wrong with the policy as it's written at the moment in terms of soundness and the suggested changes that the council's putting in?
Because it provides no particular certainty nor impose any particular requirements. It reads like a statement of intent, or a statement which speculates. It's a strategic development that could play a key role in establishing a decentralised energy network, should engage at an early stage with the council. And of course, strategic development doesn't engage, it's applicants who engage. To establish future energy requirements and infrastructure arising from large-scale development proposals, etc. That was
so
taken
going
out.
straight into
it didn't add anything.
So going straight into what is currently criterion B, so that would now become the first one. That does make much more sense, because having statements in policies just doesn't add anything.
Absolutely.
To that. So yes, we're content with that approach. Everything else in relation to the proposed or the suggested changes that are set out in under BE04, I haven't got any further questions on that.
I'm grateful for that, thank you.
So you don't need to go through that in any more detail. Unless anybody else has any other questions who's in this session. It's only the County Council. So if we move on to BE05, let me just have a look at the wording as it stands. Oh, it's I suppose my question is, what's the purpose of this policy? It's assessing energy infrastructure. So it's from a development management perspective. So I was just trying to understand what's its purpose when you've got other. You've just had BE04, which sets out all your energy infrastructure, low carbon and renewable energy infrastructure elements. So
yeah, unless there's something particular to energy infrastructure or installations that require specific treatment, then I anticipate what you're going to say is, unless that is the case, then there shouldn't be a standalone policy relating to this, because it's covered by other policies.
Correctly, Mr. Shadarabian. Yes. Again, not necessarily an issue in relation to, if there is something very specific where the process of assessing any proposals coming forward for energy infrastructure is going to be different to how the council would deal with any other proposals, then I will, if the council could just have a look at that to just see whether there is anything in particular. Not now, because obviously we are running out of time a little bit here. And just let you know, I am proposing to finish 13F, and then 13G we're going to have to move to this afternoon. But that's okay, because there's no other participants, it's just ourselves.
Okay. No, I think it's highly likely that this policy can be deleted because it's simply unnecessary. But I would check to make absolutely sure that there's nothing specific about this type of development that requires.
It's whether it's causing. Yeah, it's having a policy in isn't necessarily an issue in terms of soundness, but it's whether it's effective in terms of, does it confuse the assessment of any energy infrastructure proposals that may come forward. So
yes, because of development. Yes, on an appeal, someone might say, well, this is a relevant policy, therefore we don't have to comply with the others. Absolutely understood.
I've got my appeals inspector hat on here, so
I'm very pleased you have.
Yes. Okay, so if we can move on to BE06. Now, no suggested changes have been put forward in F9A, but again, the question is, what is this seeking to achieve, and is it appropriate to require energy efficiency improvements to existing dwellings if somebody's putting forward an extension and a proposal for an extension? So is that applicable, and is this just a building regulations matter?
I think it
from
is.
A planning perspective.
Yeah, I think it's more a regulations matter than a planning matter. And of course, BE02 deals with sustainable construction and resource efficiency.
Okay.
And of course, we have the
Thank you.
requirements
So
of
can you
BE03
look
as
at
well.
whether that policy can be deleted? No, there's nothing in there that does need to remain.
Check that.
To me, it doesn't need to, but I think it just adds confusion and it's not relevant for planning policies to set out building regulations. So
I agree. Thank you very much. I'll check
right,
it to make
sure. And BE07, please. Now, there are some suggested changes which I think are just appear to be, it's sort of tidying up the policy slightly, but I think it makes it more specific, is my reading of F9A, to ensure that the policy is effective.
Yes, ma'am. And also maximising passive ventilation is something which we ought now to do in line with building for healthy light, etc.
Okay. I've got no further questions on that policy, unless anybody else has, but nobody's putting hands up. And then let's move to BE08, which is your sustainable drainage policy.
There are very few changes proposed to this in F9A.
And again, it's sort of tidying up, but making it more specific, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
In terms of the requirements, making it very clearer.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I haven't got any further questions on that.
Thank you, Mom.
I was just about to bring in Mr. Warden. Do you have any specific questions you want to raise?
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Not a specific question, but just an observation, something for the council to maybe think about, is that some of the detail that the council has put in forward in some of the policies, which I think we're thinking is not necessary within policy. I just wonder whether post-adoption of plan might be something that might be appropriate in a supplementary plan document, which might give some guidance for developers on some of the matters which the council is seeking to secure and see within applications.
That's a very helpful suggestion. Thank you very much, sir. We'll consider that, most certainly.
Thank you, Inspector. That is actually a conversation we've been having together over the past few days, reflecting on something of that, and I am mindful to bring forward to the council a revised LDS that begins to set out thought process around producing such a document. So I think that would be a helpful addition to this work.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mr. Ratcliffe, please?
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. It's a question. I don't know whether it's the appropriate time to pose this question and whether it fits in another session, but it is about sustainable development, and probably like everybody else, having read through lots of papers, it does get a little bit confusing. But I'm just wondering how the impact of everything we've been talking about on sustainable development impacts on greenbelt release and exceptional circumstances. You know, all the issues that we've spoken about during the course of the morning and other sessions. Is it going to be very clear how this fits in with greenbelt release? Potential greenbelt release.
Do you wish to have that discussion, Mr. Ratcliffe, with the council outside of the remit of this examination? Would that be useful for you?
It would be. I must admit, I'm in conversation with Mr. Drain on a variety of issues, and there was something else that Miss Wong was looking at the other day. So if Mr. Drain would allow me to send him another email and perhaps he can find time to respond, that would be great. Thank you.
Mr. Drain, are you happy to do that outside the remit of the?
Yes, indeed, and we can pick up on the things that you've asked us to do in terms of those provision of exceptional circumstances. So yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you.
Mr. Ratcliffe, in relation to the examination doesn't deal with very special circumstances. That's why we deal with exceptional circumstances, which is different, completely different kettle of fish. So that's why I've asked that you have that conversation with the council outside of the remit of the examination. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
On that note, then, I would like to finish that session. I'm just quickly looking because we do have a few minutes. Just looking at who we've got coming this afternoon. I think what I would like to do, because I think the matter 13G, I don't think it's going to be a long session, matter 13G, and it's obviously between us as inspectors and the council. There are no other participants coming along to that session, but there are a number of policies that we do need to go to. What I would like to do is propose that we move 13G to the end of this afternoon's session. It shouldn't take long to go through, but I don't think we'll get through it in 8 minutes. So I think I would rather that we took a break now and just move that to the end of this afternoon session after 13C, if that's acceptable.
Right.
Okay. This afternoon session shouldn't be too long, she says confidently. So hopefully it will be no problem just fitting it in there. Okay.
Indeed.
I think we need a bit of a break. Let's just put it that way. So,
thank you, Mark. Thank you.
I think we all do. Okay, so thank you very much for all the participants that have obviously been involved in the discussions this morning, and we will resume back on the new invite at 2 o'clock. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.